is AWANI Global with me, Nailah Huda. And this month we dive into key events defining the year 2025 and what we can expect in the coming year. And in this week's episode, we take a close look at key shifts in the global economy, from trade policies and restrictions to a crisis in multilateralism and growing uncertainty. And we want to understand whether these big trends and patterns could potentially spell the fate for the global economy in the year 2026 and how countries can enhance resilience in the face of uncertainty. And joining us at this hour to unpack some of these key questions, we have joining us online Professor Dr. Rajah, Distinguished Professor of Economics at the Asia-Europe Institute of University Malaya. And joining us in the studio, we have Dr. Juita Mohamad, Senior Lecturer at the Department of Economics, University Malaya, and Consultant for the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. Thank you so much, Prof. and Dr. Juita, for joining us. Perhaps I'd like to start with Prof. Rajah. If you could perhaps shortlist, narrow down to perhaps 2-3 key events or shifts defining the global economy in the past year, in 2025, Prof.
The first, obviously, the world has been facing something they never expected, say, 10 years ago, which is the scammering tactics of President Donald Trump in what we refer to as the tariff trigger, which goes against the normal norm that we have in relation to how trade has been promoted over the last several decades. So obviously, it has created chaos. For the first time, it has also led to economies being united, whether they are free market apostles or whether they are those who believe in some sort of state intervention. They are all together to say that such tariffs will be counterproductive for the US, and it will only reduce global trade in terms of real value in relation to what the norm will be with the growth in population. And that actually means that we'll be working in an environment of smaller markets. And therefore, it presents us with another big problem that the world just came out from. We already came out from the COVID-19 pandemic, and now we have a double whammy with this attempt by the United States to go back on normal trade rules that the World Trade Organization has always promoted.
Dr. Juita, do you agree, or perhaps do you have another list of some of the key shifts that's defined this past year?
I agree with Professor Rasiah. It is a new world order where we see trade policies being weaponized for political gains, and this is something that is moving away from the WTO agreements and WTO arrangements. But putting that aside, I think I would like to highlight as well, looking at these uncertainties, looking at geopolitical tension, trade tension, wars, genocide even, it was predicted that global GDP growth for this year will slow down and for next year to go even slower than this year. But then looking at publications from September of this year, we, as the global community, growth has actually been quite resilient. And for the first half of this year, we did see that global economic growth were recorded at 3.2%. So because of this resilience and because of how, I will come back to the trade numbers later on, it seems that even with increase of, the increase of tariffs, in some parts of the world, we do see that trade growth has been quite promising, and because of this as well, the projected growth for next year will be even higher than this year. So again, we do see that the global economic environment is very dynamic. It can change from one quarter to the next. It has made me a bit hopeful about the global growth, the global economic growth from next year onwards.
Prof, what do you make of this? Despite these steep ups and downs, we are seeing that the global economic activity has remained somewhat resilient. How would you describe the overall economic growth this year? What do you make of this resilience?
I think I'm not sure whether I would share that position as such. If you look at what Jerome Powell is saying, the Fed chief, because the US always fears getting a recession, which actually means that you have 2 consecutive quarters of contraction in GDP, which is why they often, when such a development is imminent, they'll tend to raise interest rates to stimulate savings. So you reduce the velocity of circulation in the market, and therefore you will cap inflation that way. The preferred interest rate Fed goes for is 2%. And at the moment, it's touching quite close to 3%. And you also have somewhat of a position that often economists are saying the US is into a likely recession, which is why, on the one hand, President Trump is telling him to actually lower interest rates to stimulate investment. But the consequence of that may actually mean that you will have inflation. And that's why Jerome Powell has been warning that the potential for a stagflation taking place, a situation where unemployment rises at the same time inflation rises. You have both occurring at the same time. The Phillips curve would be broken at that time. So that's the warning. But of course, some economies remain resilient. Malaysia, yes. In fact, our trade surplus hasn't really gone down as such. And we keep our interest rates relatively low in the sense that our overnight rate OPR is 2.75, which is relatively low. In the case of the US, I think it's 3.75 now. In that sense, to some extent, Jerome Powell has actually lowered that from the peak of 5.5% a year ago. Now, what I would say is, well, we can be quietly optimistic as far as Malaysia is concerned because we have had relatively good growth. And at the same time, this time around, our ringgit has appreciated in relation to the US dollar and also against Singapore currencies. In fact, we've done fairly well compared to most other East Asian currencies, simply because I would say, in as much as when the ringgit was falling, people were blaming the Prime Minister. I don't think he was responsible for it. And I would say the same thing now. It's appreciating. Also, I don't think it's to do with the Prime Minister as such. Now, it's the nature of trade that the exports, for example, we are in a resilient component of trade, which is electronics, a lot of it, and it goes to the US, and it doesn't face any tariffs as such for that one, even though we've been criticizing the deal that Tunku Zafrul advised our Prime Minister to sign with President Donald Trump. Those avenues are there. In other words, even if we had not signed, because most of the companies exporting from here are from the US, and therefore it doesn't really draw that much of implications as far as in terms of the overall balance of payments. You are looking at remittances after that, not just that we have a surplus, but after the repatriation of profits and so on, you wouldn't really, this is what we call invisible trade. It doesn't really show up so much. So my own feeling is, unless tensions, geopolitical tensions go down, which is also likely because countries might suddenly realize, in fact, that a group of businessmen, the smaller guys, who are criticizing Donald Trump because they are actually suffering in the US. So it might lead to consequences that may again, because trade and investments are not something you see in static terms. You must see in dynamic terms. You will have reciprocation. You will have all sorts of things happening. And you may not be surprised if suddenly President Xi Jinping and President Trump sit together and say, guys, we shall end it. And therefore, my own impressions are it's difficult to predict for next year, but the trends seem to show that it may not be as rosy if we see what the big actors are doing, and including the EU. The EU remains in a very strong position against Russia, for example. Not so much Donald Trump's United States, because they are looking for peace. They are looking for some sort of an arrangement to end the Ukraine-Russian war. Likewise, he's also looking at similar things. And in fact, Marco Rubio has called ties to stop the border war that's going on now, bombing here and there. So I just hope, in as much as Professor Juita mentioned just now, this is hopeful. I'm also hopeful that who wants war? We like to see peace. We like to see prosperity.
Yeah, it's great to hear this sort of optimism, but I do want to shift gears a little bit. As you said, you're quite hopeful or optimistic about the coming year. But what do you think, Dr. Juita, are some of the key opportunities or potentially risks that we should look out for in 2026? I mean, some of the shifts, some of the concerns that we're seeing this year with financial instability, tariffs, and slowing demand. Do you think that these are some of the risks that we'll see continuing in 2026?
Well, if I can circle back to trade, we're not out of the woods yet from the art agreement. We still have to ratify the agreement, and if I'm not mistaken, we have 90 days to do so after signing. So for now, on how it's going to be implemented, it's still a bit murky. So again, those to me are some of the downside risks that exporters and even policymakers might be looking into. The other downside risks would include the slowing down of the two giant economies, China and also the US. Another downside risk that I do see is from the introduction of CBAM. So from, if I'm not mistaken, 2023 to 2025, there was a transition period for importers to have their instruments be aligned with the CBAM mechanism, but 2026, which is next year, is when it's going to be implemented. So again, those exporters from Malaysia who are going to be exporting their products into the EU, then they will need to adjust or align their tools and instruments for the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So, and also on the other downside is the continuous war and genocide. So this will definitely impact global stability and also supply chain reconfiguration in the immediate term. But I do see upside risks, but I'm not all that optimistic about these upside risks, because there are downside risks from these opportunities. So again, we do see that investments into AI will grow, and I don't see this as a fad or a bubble. It's going to be here for the long term. I do see this sector growing, and with this, there's demand for data centers. So Malaysia is also in talks with other countries, including the US, on how to cooperate on rare earth trade as well. And this comes with risks when we think about the energy divide and also the pollution of the rural communities. And this is the work that I do with the UNDP on green resilience. We do see that trade, unfortunately, is not felt, or the benefits of trade are not trickled down to these rural communities. So I think it's very important for us to ensure that whatever investments that we attract do give a positive impact to the vulnerable households and vulnerable groups.
Prof, you mentioned that you are trying to be quite hopeful about the coming year, and as you said, maybe geopolitical tensions might ease a little bit when businessmen realize it's not good for business. But what do you think are some of the other key opportunities or risks that we should look out for in the coming year?
Starting from the side of risks, I think one thing, and this is really something that President Donald Trump, the first time and the second time now has done, is to revoke America's participation in the Paris Agreement, which is to do with what the UN Convention for Climate Change is up to. And one of the things I noticed is, unlike what Nancy Pelosi took before, you have a situation where he neither supports the idea of promoting biodiversity. In fact, if you look at how the US embassy here has organized itself in terms of the grants and so on it's giving. That's out of it. And including, he's actually called for the reopening of coal mines in the Appalachians. So on that front, the EU is very strong on that. But again, you have to also recognize that there are other problems that have arisen simply because one of which is Indonesia successfully won its quarrel with the EU for unilaterally deciding that it will not import any more palm oil from anywhere. And that actually, having lost that, it has some implications because the EU, unlike the ASEAN that we have, it's a body that collectively acts. It's not a situation where we just see, we some sort of agreement we have, we don't intervene in their personal affairs, and therefore business as usual can go on. So the EU acts as a collective body in that sense. So I'm not sure how the reactions will be there in relation to the RCEP which is evolving further and further to the extent of ensuring that markets remain open. And that's some of the downside risks I'm talking about. And also the fact that in particular Germany, in the case of the UK, Ukraine-Russia war, you have a situation where Trump is really emboldened with the notion that they should stop the war, telling Zelensky that he has to accept some sort of compromises in order to have that peace taking place. But the EU is against that. And at the same time, you have a situation where the central bank chief in Brussels, Christine Lagarde, has actually called for alternative payments, no longer relying on all these American payment systems, and telling the EU that they must have autonomy. Unlike in the past where they worked under the framework of the NATO, where they were working together, especially the former Prime Minister of Denmark, Rasmussen, he called the US as the policeman of the world, that they should support for global peace. I think that's increasingly cracking. So that is no longer the case. And also, BRICS should not be seen as a body like, say, NATO, where you get into one side of it. BRICS is an alternative that's emerging, and it started in many ways ideologically when Sukarno called for the Bandung meeting. And the notion of non-alignment, which formally was ratified in Belgrade by Tito. And subsequently, what they're doing are things that doesn't really show that they're out to contain the US. Although, of course, there have been lots of reports that the Russians and the Chinese are dumping the US dollar. But now coming back to the part that I like quite much is the fact, even though we've been criticizing the Prime Minister, I use the word we and not necessarily me, because he invited President Donald Trump. Among the things I saw that were quite useful is the willingness of a president who had not been to Southeast Asia before that to come and discuss something openly at a time when the Prime Minister was criticizing America's stand against in support of Israel on the Gaza issue. And not just that, but also on many other issues where the position of BRICS seems to be the line being taken in that sense consistently with the position of Malaysia in the 60s and 72 when Tun Razak promoted the idea of Zokfan. And at the same time, the notion that we remain non-aligned. We have a foreign policy that does not link with any superpower. Not that we take any side, no. So I think consistently and that did not seem like what the US would have done last time. Rubbished completely as just an ideologue discussion. So my feeling is that opportunity comes by. Second, he's also taken a few other positive things in the sense that the negotiation, and as what Dr. Juita mentioned just now, we still have days, and we can always pull back. If you look at the whole agreement, which I read carefully, at any one time you can pull out of it. And of course, I'm not sure the other part of it because I have not done the empirical assessment of it, that we would lose trade to the amount of 200 billion US. Now, if it is really valid, and the fact that we retain the flexibility to pull out, I think that's the sort of direction we should take. Farisno also makes that sort of line, rather than taking a position of delinking from. It's not just the US. If you delink from the US, you'll also delink with all the allies of the US in many ways. That will be something that will cascade down in a domino sense. So That's the opportunistic part that we've seen now. Malaysia is hurt. To me, it is people are here in Malaysia. You had a situation where Macron was here, Lula from Brazil was here, the Prime Minister of Canada was here. A lot of them here willing to discuss this. I think that's the opportunistic part of it because it gives you room for cooperation, voices to be heard.
Yeah. Now, taking into account, or keeping in mind these sort of concerns about multilateralism, about this framework for working together internationally that's increasingly cracking, as Prof has said, let's try to situate or contextualize this, in countries in this part of the world. Dr. Juita, if we were to contextualize this for middle and low income countries, particularly in this part of the world, there's concerns about how 2026, the coming year, may bring about increased vulnerability due to weaker demand, structural shifts, concerns about unilateral trade measures. What do you think are some of the policy choices that countries, middle and low income countries specifically, should prioritize to enhance resilience? Some of what we've seen this year.
Thank you for that very important question. I think what countries within this region is doing to secure the future trade and also investment growth is by signing on to more multilateral agreements, upgrading our existing multilateral agreements. So during the ASEAN summit, we already upgraded our ASEAN-China 3.0 agreement that was years in the making. We're also due to review and upgrade possibly the CPTPP agreement, and this goes the same with the RCEP agreement. So we do see that there's also an increase of the signing of bilateral agreements with like-minded countries, Malaysia and South Korea, for example. So I think this is a good sign that countries within the region are looking outward. It's not good to be looking inwards like the US, but this is a good sign that international cooperation, regional cooperation is still very much intact. But as Professor Rasiah mentioned, there are economists out there who think that maybe there will be a recession. I mean, we've highlighted this maybe for 2 or 3 years now. Like there could be a possible recession that's going to happen in the US. So as a small open economy like Malaysia, I think we have to brace for it. We have to make sure that our macroeconomic indicators are sound, our financial institutions are sound, and of course during recessionary periods globally, we have to take a somewhat expansionary fiscal policy stance. So I'm not talking about unbridled spending, because this is also important, because we have to ensure that the impacts of the weakening of the global demand and also the impact from other global shocks can be minimized in the immediate to near term. So again, this is important because it can boost aggregate demand, it can stimulate economic growth, and also it can also reduce unemployment. Basically, it's all about putting more money into consumers' hands. But again, we need to be quite prudent here. We need to check our spending so that it doesn't result in a significant widening of our budget deficit. So I also wanted to highlight here that it's all good that our GDP growth is on track or as projected, or even higher as projected. But I do have to emphasize here that during economic downturn, we need to continue to protect the most vulnerable households. And this is through targeted assistance, this is through subsidies, targeted subsidies, and making sure that our healthcare and also education services are also accessible for the vulnerable households. So we are as good as our weakest link. Let's make sure that our trade activities and our investment activities, the benefits of those activities are felt even at the most vulnerable, within the most vulnerable groups in Malaysia.
A very important point there. We have just about 1-2 minutes left, so I'm sorry to have to make Prof keep his answer a bit brief here. But Prof, following from that, for middle and low income countries like ours, what do you think we should prioritize policy-wise to enhance resilience in the face of these global shocks in the coming year?
In the interest of time, I'll just focus on one point. Our central bank and instruments that are related to it, I have actually learned a lot. Let's note that when the Asian financial crisis struck, we had a situation of a bubble evolving. You call it economy membahang that time. That overheating economy, because we had a situation where balance of trade was facing a chronic imbalance from 1989 right until the time that ringgit crashed. Yet our GDP growth rate for many years exceeded 9%. That's only because we had massive investments from abroad. I have this chapter in a book I did to honor the former central bank governor. Now, this particular one is a situation where, because of the Plaza Accord, you have all these currencies from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, as well as Hong Kong, soaring in ways where it became costly for them. They relocated in the whole of Southeast Asia. That actually led to an increase in demand, but we had severe bottlenecks in the sense that we didn't have the infrastructure, we didn't have enough power, all sorts of things happened there. Now, it actually built that bubble that eventually crashed. I'm not telling that George Soros had no effect on that. I only gave him the opportunity to do that from the Thai economy. But coming back to that, we had severe non-payment issues, which again we learned so much when the global financial crisis struck in 2007 to 2009. We didn't have that problem. Not just Malaysia, all the East Asian countries had already learned from that. Now the next thing we have is a situation where the COVID-19 crisis struck. And it was actually the purchase of vaccines and so on that led to the blowing up of our fiscal deficit. In other words, generally, we had very good macroeconomic fundamentals. But even there, we see a serious effort there to lower it. And in fact, we are expecting it to be met by the end of this year. The deficit, 3.8%, and then eventually by 2030, 3.5%. Now, to me, the deficit is more important, fiscal deficit is more important than the debt to GDP ratio. As everybody knows, the debt to GDP ratio of Singapore is 170%. And yet, it's doing very well because it manages its account very well. Now, I'm mentioning that we, in that sense, are very well placed in that sense. But I think what they should do is to strengthen those instruments further. We have very good social security nets and so on because we learned from the past too. Now, in addition to refining them, we should track what potential problems are likely, impossible to predict, but that should always be a focus of us. And at the same time, strengthening the instruments that we started with. They're all good instruments that are there. It's a question of how effectively you implement them.
Really sorry to have to cut you short there, but that is all the time that we have. Thank you so much to Prof. Rajah and Dr. Juita for joining us today for a very valuable, invaluable Economics 101 class and what we can expect in the coming year. Thank you once again to Prof. and Dr. Juita for joining us on AWANI Global. That is all on this week's episode. We'll catch you the next time.